homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today in the kitchen we are making chokecherry jam. Chokecherries are a native smallish tree that are native to most of the United States. It's something you'll see along waterways, creeks, and streams, and they are commonly spread by birds because the wildlife loves to eat them. And so we have them randomly coming up in different places on our property where birds have dropped a seed and it's managed to sprout. And in fact, this jam was made from a chokecherry tree that was planted by a bird right near our mailbox at the front of our property. And we pretty quickly recognized what it was, and it wasn't in a bad spot, and so we just decided to leave it there. And it's been growing probably for 10 years or so, and this is the first year that I've actually seen a reasonable crop on it. Although I have to admit, I am usually so busy in late July and early August with other things that I'm canning and preserving and picking and harvesting that a lot of times I'll briefly notice that there's a few chokecherries around and then I never go back and pick them because I simply don't have time. This year I've scaled way back on the amount of produce that I'm growing, and actually also the amount that I'm canning. I'm trying to eat down some of my stores that I already have. And so this year I noticed the chokecherry had fruit on it, and I thought, I haven't made chokecherry jam in many, many years. That would be a really fun project. I have a blog post on this from, I think, 2010. Before I started doing YouTube and directing people to my blog, it was one of the most popular blog posts of everything that was on there. So I know there's some interest in chokecherries and what to do with them. They are virtually inedible when they are just off of the tree. They have a very tannic, kind of bitter flavor to them that can be very off-putting if you eat them raw. Fun story, my father was one of 10 kids growing up in the middle of Montana, and he was born in 1923, so he was kind of a Depression-era baby. And he used to tell me that they were so hungry for fresh fruit in the summertime that they would eat chokecherries raw right off of the tree. That said, I've come to understand that he also had 5 brothers, and he was the second youngest, and they're all pranksters, they're all jokesters, they are all constantly ribbing each other. I once went to a family reunion and realized that a lot of the behavior that I had attributed to my father being in the Navy was actually just my father's family, because they're all that way. And my guess is a lot of the chokecherries that they were eating as a kid was probably on a dare, because they will definitely kind of suck the spit out of your mouth. They are not something that you want to eat raw. However, if you add enough sugar, they make a delicious jam. You can also make this as a jelly, in which case you would want to strain the juice that you've got in a jelly bag and then proceed accordingly. I'm not the kind of person who makes jellies. I find them incredibly fiddly. I really don't care if my preserves are crystal clear. And you also end up wasting a ton of fruit. And chokecherries, the seed on them is about half the size of the fruit itself. So the seed takes up a ton of room, and so it's hard to get a lot of pulp in order to make a jam anyway. And you would have even less if you made a jelly, because you would lose all of the pulp that you got from that fruit. So you would probably, I would guess, I made this out of 4 pounds of chokecherries. I would guess if you wanted to make a jelly instead of a jam, you should probably double that amount, because it's not going to give you a lot of juice. But it's one of my husband's very favorite fruits in terms of a jam, and I add a little bit of almond to this. Cherry and almonds are great friends. They're actually related, and so almond flavor in cherry things is delicious. One of my aunts who used to make chokecherry jam, she would actually purposely break up the seeds in order to get some almond flavor in her jam. The seeds do contain a small amount of cyanide, not enough probably to actually do any damage, but I don't recommend that as a way of getting some almond flavor in your jam. I think if you want some almond flavor, just buy a little almond extract, which is what I'm doing here. But chokecherry jam, delicious. You can also make syrup out of this, and you can also make chokecherry wine. I've done all of those things. So a really lovely wild foraged fruit that is available right now across most of the United States. So chokecherry jam, let's get started.
So I'm measuring out 4 pounds of chokecherries here. And I don't know what the volume of this is. I'm just so used to doing everything with a scale that I'm not sure what that would actually weigh out to be. And then I'm going to give everybody a good bath. These are very popular with birds, and the birds will usually sit perched high in the tree and eat berries, and then the bird droppings are ending up on the lower berries. And so it's a good idea to give everything a good wash here. And then I'm picking out anything that floats, berries, leaves, whatever, detritus. And then I have an assortment here of lighter colored berries that weren't quite ripe. And so I'm also trying to pick those out. And then I did have a few that were just dried up. They were older or that had been pecked by a bird and then dried out. And so I'm picking those out as well. So this is a little tedious. You can see here's a not quite ripe berry. And I did not stem these. You could go through here and pull off every one of the stems that's on these tiny little berries, but that just seemed wildly tedious, and I just made me want to cry thinking about it. And so I did not take the stems off of these. And then into a pot they go, and I'm going to add 1 cup of water so that they don't burn, and then heat that on very low heat. You're going to want to bring that up to a simmer, give it a stir a couple of times so that the stuff on the bottom is getting moved around. And then once it's up to a simmer, you're going to want to put the lid on and simmer it, again, lowest heat possible here, for about 15 minutes. And then into a food mill it goes. I'll put a link to America's Test Kitchen's recommended food mill. This one is something that I picked up at a hardware store probably 20 years ago, and I don't think it's available anymore. The trick to food mills is not overfilling them, and then they usually come with different screens. I'm using the finest mesh screen here, and because some of the seeds in these berries are pretty small, because some of the fruit is pretty small, I did have a few that either just popped out and landed in the pulp, or that managed to go through this little screen. But you want the smallest screen possible here. And the seeds will hang up a little bit occasionally. And so I'll reverse direction in order to unstick things and then stir it again. And it's just trial and error. You get used to doing this after a while. Push everything down. You can kind of see whether everything's pulped out or whether or not you've still got some whole berries in there. And then once you're down to what looks like mostly seeds, clean it out, throw that in your compost bucket, add some more. And it's tedious, but it doesn't take that long, maybe 5 minutes at the most. And these were not the juiciest chokecherries I've ever worked with. They were definitely a little bit on the dry side. We've had crazy heat in the last month. I think we had 17 days in July that were over 95. And while this tree does get a little bit of water from some irrigation that we do, it's somewhat inconsistent this time of year. And so these berries were not super juicy. I imagine if they had been along a river or a riparian zone where they had their roots deep in the water, they would have been a little bit more juicy. So here's our pulp, and you can see that the stems did not really come through, and so we managed to filter out most of those stems. I'm going to measure out 3 cups of the pulp. I had a little bit of extra that I ended up making some liqueur with it instead. And this recipe originally came from the Gel website, and it's no longer available, but this was just literally right off of the Gel website years and years ago. And then I'm adding in the Gel, pectin, and a 1/4 cup of sugar mixed into that. And that's a 1/4 cup out of the total amount of sugar in the recipe. So it's not in addition to, it's including. And the sugar is just helping this with distribution so that it doesn't clump up. You want to let your pulp cool off a little bit before you add this pectin. If your pulp is like wicked hot, that pectin will hit that hot liquid and it'll clump. And so you need your pulp to be cooled down a little bit in order for this to easily stir in. Notice I'm not adding all the sugar yet. This is just the pectin and a little bit of sugar. And then I'm heating my pulp back up to a boiling point. So giving that a really good stir, making sure there are no clumps. I'm also adding a 1/4 cup of lemon juice, and this could be fresh lemon juice or bottled lemon juice. I actually, when I originally did this recipe, I made multiple batches from different recipes, and the one that set up the best and the one that we liked the flavor of best ended up having the lemon juice in it. Jam is a interesting chemical reaction between the acid in the fruit and the pectin that's in the fruit and some other things. It's complicated. And so sometimes if you don't have something set, but you followed all the directions, it's probably because you're missing a little bit of acid. Once that's up to a full rolling boil, we're going to add in the rest of our sugar. And this is one of the few recipes that I make where I actually use full sugar pectin. So this is 4.5 cups of sugar to 3 cups of pulp. And that's simply because these chokecherries are so kind of inedible when they're raw that I want that full amount of sugar. You could probably make this with a low sugar pectin and just follow the exact same directions, but reduce the sugar by probably a cup or so. But I've never done that. I think this is the one case in my life where I think full sugar is warranted in terms of this fruit. So giving everything a good stir. When you do this, if you're making jam, and this applies to any jam you're making, you are drastically reducing the temperature by adding that sugar in. Oh, see, I missed a pit there. And so the sugar is going to reduce the temperature, and then the sugar, once it's dissolved, is actually going to raise the boiling point. And so it's going to take a little bit for this to come back to a boil. Again, I have this on low heat. This pulp is really thick, and because of that, it's going to be really easy to scorch. And so I've got it on the lowest heat possible. There's some almond extract going in. I think I used a teaspoon. And then once it's come back to a full rolling boil for 2 minutes, turn the heat off and start filling your jars. I'm just using 8-ounce jelly jars here. And this is really thick. I probably haven't made chokecherry jam in 6 or 7 years, but I do not remember it being this thick in the past, which is an indication to me that these berries were not super juicy. And normally in the past, I've gotten 7 cups of jam out of this recipe, and in this one, I only got 6. And so again, I think that's an indication of not really juicy berries. And so I tend to go through, fill my jars most of the way up to kind of get an idea of how many I'm going to need. And then I go back in and top them off. You want 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch of headspace here. I think I probably ended up with about 1/4 just because I was a little bit short on pulp. And headspace is mostly about oxygen space. And so it's okay if this is not at 1/8 of an inch. It's okay if it's at 1/4 of an inch. You may end up with some discoloration over time in storage because you've got a little more oxygen in there, but it is not going to cause spoilage if your headspace is slightly larger than what the original recipe called for. And I am scraping the bottom of this to get 6 full jars here. My hands are clean. And you can see this is almost like a butter. It's really thick. So wiping the rims on everything, and I had one jar that I had really spilled on the side of, and so I'm wiping everything else first, and then I'm saving that one that's really messy for last so that I don't have a lot of jam on my paper towel as I'm wiping my rims here, because I knew that one was going to make everything super messy. So here's our filled jars. And then I'm capping finger tight. And I have an odd assortment of lids here because I'm making this up in my commercial kitchen, and I don't usually keep regular canning lids up here, and I forgot that I didn't have any regular canning lids up here, so I was kind of scrambling for the odds and ends of what I did have available, and so none of these lids match, which is just kind of funny. They did all seal. Last one. And again, finger tight is so that as the contents heats up and that air needs to go someplace, it can push itself out around the rim of your jar. And so that's what finger tight means. You don't want it so tight that that air cannot escape as it heats. This is going into a boiling water bath canner. You do need some kind of a rack on the bottom. You can use a lot of different things as a rack on the bottom. And then I'm going to bring that up to a full rolling boil before I start my timer. Recipes in the research on this from many years ago were anywhere from 5 minutes of processing time to 10 minutes of processing time. 10 minutes is pretty standard for almost any jam recipe anymore. They've kind of standardized it. I went for 15 just because I knew this was extra thick and so therefore extra dense, and I wanted to make sure I got full heat penetration. That extra 5 minutes is not going to hurt anything in terms of processing time. And then once it was done, I turned the water off, let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then out come my jars. And there's this whole thing about not tipping your jars when you pull them out of the canner. I don't subscribe to that. I think it's silly, and I have hard water. And so if I don't tip the water off the lid of my jars, I end up with a water stain. Fogging up the lens. Yeah, you can see all the different lids I've got here. I've got cur and 4 jars, and there's probably a ball one in there. But there you go, chokecherry jam, all finished, cooling, and ready to go. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.